Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with lies they eat like comfort food, to disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims? Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace, but ilkas and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible, holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal to have to prove a claim you make, and folks really feel ashamed expressing content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes, it's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason stay strapped with logic and facts. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact and help the truth world. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason.
Hi, welcome to Road to Reason. I'm Rob Penczak.
And I'm Larry Mendoza.
Thank you for joining us this week. We are going to start off with just a brief overview of the show, do some news, some introductions, announcements, and then we're going to bring on our main guest for the day. So I want to start with an overview. Today we're going to have Andy Thompson. He's going to join us. He was with us a couple of years ago. We're going to be talking about, in part, why we believe in gods. And we're also going to be talking about this new edition which came out. And we're going to explain why that's so important and the great risks that people are taking in bringing important information to the world. So we'll have Andy on to talk about that. We're also going to go through evolutionary psychology a little bit and suicide terrorism. So we'll have some very interesting topics.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to that conversation. It's going to be pretty good.
Now, in terms of other things that are coming our way, on November 15th, if you're in the Richmond area or nearby, Andy Thompson is actually coming down next Sunday to talk about why we believe in gods and the science behind that. And he's going to be joined by a few other panelists for the second half of that program to talk about important topics and suicide. So I hope you're able to join us for that if you're anywhere in the area. Sorry?
So another announcement, I wanted to mention that on December 6th, Road to Reason is going to have their annual Christmas special, and it'll be interesting. As you can see there from the graphics, it's going to be Jesus versus Mr. Hankey. Make sure you tune in. There'll be a live debate, and we welcome some callers. It'll be fun. So make sure you tune in on that one.
Okay. We also have we have 5 new hosts that are going to be joining us.
Right.
You've met a couple of them already. We're going to have more over the next 1.5 months or so. I think you'll get to meet everybody. So we're very excited to have those guys giving some relief to a few people. Like Larry's doing a bunch of shows. This really does take a commitment on people's parts, and we appreciate both the people in the back room and the hosts that take off their Sundays to come out and help us.
Right, absolutely. And yeah, so we're looking forward to actually, and it brings a new perspective. So we want this show to be a community show. So if anybody's actually interested in coming on the show and helping out, both either in the back or in front of the cameras, we also would appreciate that.
Right, and if you have topics that you want to hear us discuss, if you have ideas, you're welcome to call in, you're welcome to post stuff on Facebook. We do take that stuff seriously. We try to incorporate it, so we would love to bring the community into this. Good. Now, on news stories for today, the first one we're going to talk about is new Mormon policy makes apostates out of married same-sex couples and bars their children from getting rights. So, Mormons have had a long history of not being friendly to African Americans and of not being friendly to gay people. This is one of those places where religion can be an incredibly divisive thing.
Right.
I wanted to jump to one of the things I found comical, in this article, where I think there's a parent saying, "I cannot imagine Jesus Christ denying any child a baptism because of the status of their parents," he said. "It goes against everything I ever thought the Savior and baptism was about." So yes, we should not be discriminating against the children of gay people, but does that imply that Jesus would be perfectly fine being against the gay couple themselves? And what about original sin? I mean, isn't that the whole basis?
That's the whole point,
of
right? Of baptism. And the Mormons are also have their own weird, edicts and dogma that they follow. I know a lot of Christians don't even consider them a Christian doctrine. But what's funny is, yeah, you're right. If original sin is washed away because of baptism, why would you deny a baby baptism to wash away? I mean, from a theological perspective, it just makes weird sense.
And the whole concept of sin being passed down is part and parcel of Christianity. So I agree with the sentiment that it's a shame to do anything that's going to discriminate against anybody, but this shows sort of how religion can blind you to the fact that discriminating against gay people is bad, and that this whole concept of original sin is part of the package that you've signed on to. So that's enough on that one. What else? What do you got?
Oh, well, this is an interesting story that came out this past week, I believe. There was a study that was done across about 5 or 6 countries. I believe it was Canada, China, Jordan, Turkey, USA, and South Africa. So very diverse. I guess the researchers that were doing this tried to pick countries of diverse backgrounds and cultures, and they found that children raised without religion show more empathy and kindness. Now, this was a study done by from the researchers at University of Chicago, and they followed and looked at 1,170 students between the age of 5 and 12, I believe, and really found that the results of this study were that if the correct term they use here is family religious identification decreases children's altruistic behavior, and children from religious households are harsher in their punitive tendencies. Now, with everything in science and studies like this, there's always a correlation/causation issue, so we need to be careful about drawing certain conclusions. However, it's interesting that out of all of these kids from all over the world, that they found similar pattern. That's the most interesting part about this.
And it also very strongly speaks against the assumption that atheists are amoral,
right,
and that as secularism disappears from society, we're going to have calamities, despite what you see in all of the secular societies.
And regardless of any causational thing, certainly one of the studies, what this study does say is that certainly that if you are an atheist or if you don't have any religion in your life, it doesn't necessarily mean, as you said, that you're going to be raising immoral or non-empathetic kids. Mm-hmm. And so this study, at the very least, dismantles the idea that atheists can be immoral or that are immoral.
And one of the other interesting notes in there is it said that the parents of the children, the religious parents, all thought that their kids were more moral.
Right. So yeah, well, that's the thing, right?
And it's important to look at the data, actually.
That's usually the story we hear is that children raised in religious families are going to be better, suited to be, more altruistic and more helpful. And instead, it's and I don't know why, they say here, the children are harsher in their punitive tendencies. So that tends to kind of tie into the idea of this belief of eternal punishment, if you're bad. So I guess these kids, if they're, if they see they're raised with religion who says, well, gay people are bad, and they tend to be harsher and more punitive towards, I guess, other peers or maybe that are gay, for example, and they become very, very mean.
I think religion also plays into in-groups and out-groups extremely well, and Dr. Thompson will probably talk about that a little bit. And as soon as you marginalize somebody and cast them as the out-group, so if you're a secular person, it might not be quite as easy to consider another kid in the out-group. They're just another kid, another person. In religion, you have an immediate, this is not one of us.
This is an out-group, and it's an us versus them mentality, and we're seeing that even in today's world in this country. For example, this so-called persecution of Christians that is being thrown around a lot just because a Christian cannot discriminate against gay people, they feel now persecuted. Again, it's an us versus them kind of mentality, which usually, and not all, secular families, but as a general rule, if you're a decent person in general, with or without religion, people are going to be good or bad, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're a generally good person in a secular society, you're not going to automatically develop this us versus them, in-group, out-group. And so maybe this is one of the implications. It'd be interesting to see follow-up studies on this. And
I'd like to get Dr. Thompson's thoughts on that also. Like we used to, for a long time, he says until fairly recently, we grew up in small tribes, and it hasn't been a million years, it's been a few hundred years since we've become this global society. And so, I'm not sure, it'll be interesting to hear how much has evolution caught up at that, Anyway, and one other thing I want to throw in real quickly.
Sure.
Scientists reduce belief in God by shutting down the brain's medial frontal cortex. So with electromagnetic stimulation, you can change people's beliefs, you can change how authoritarian they want to be, how punitive. What does this say in terms of the mind-brain duality that some people are stuck with?
We've known for a while now, neuroscience is one of the most exciting fields probably to be in right now, is that, you can affect everything from cognitive capacities to behavior to personality just by tweaking the brain in one way or another from a physical perspective. So, I'm under the school of thought that there is no, conscious mind duality kind of thing. I think it's all, your brain and its neural circuits is what functions, is what makes your consciousness. So if you're able with a magnet to
alter somebody's thought process,
right? That to me kind of destroys the idea that there is this kind of ethereal consciousness thingy, whatever, a soul, whatever you want to call it, and that when you do die, that's it. All of that goes away.
Yeah.
And we've seen. But look at Alzheimer's. Even neurodegenerative diseases, right? When people have Alzheimer's, they stop behaving as they did, and that's because the brain is not functioning well. People with mental illness, bipolar people, schizophrenics, any of those people have a physical problem with their brain, and it shows in the behaviors and their personalities and their cognitive abilities. So yes, this falls right in line with this idea that the consciousness is a product of the brain.
And one of the places that, I don't know how much we'll talk about today, but to get into, it's really important to conceptualize mental illness as a physical problem of the brain, that it shouldn't be stigmatized and avoided. It should be treated like other medical disorders. Now, we got to move on. You've got a person of the day and then a joke of the day?
Yeah, we, every week we pick a person of the day, and this week we want to, we picked Hemant Mehta, otherwise known as the Friendly Atheist. And there you have him there giving a talk at one of the conferences. And so, in case the audience doesn't know who he is, Hemant is an author, a blogger, and an atheist activist, and he gained original fame for selling his soul on eBay, which he then wrote a book about, which is interesting because people actually started bidding on his soul on eBay. But he also has done some other interesting things, like sitting on the boards of organizations like the Secular Student Alliance and the Foundation Beyond Belief, which is a secular fundraising organization for charity, which I highly recommend people go to and check out and Google that and see if you can help with that. And he's really big right now. He runs a blog on Pathos called Friendly Atheist, where he oftentimes puts and comments on any kind of secular, religious-related, news, church-state separation. It's a very interesting blog. I don't follow many blogs. Actually, I follow hardly any blogs, but I try to keep up with his every once in a while. So
I think it's a great source of information. If you're looking for secular-related articles, you can always go there and find many interesting things going on.
And he always has some really interesting commentary on it as well. So he keeps it interesting. So thank you, Hemant. Maybe we can have him on the show at some point. I'd really like to see him be a guest here. So.
All right. Before we go to break, you're going to hit us with the.
So we also do a joke of the week, and then we'll end with that, and we'll go on break, and we'll bring in Andy. So this joke is titled, I'm going to title it "How Prayer Works." So an atheist goes to a restaurant and sits down and orders soup. The soup comes, and there's a fly swimming in it, and the atheist says, "What's this fly doing in my soup?" to the waiter, which the waiter replies, "Well, it's praying." And the atheist goes, "Aha, very funny. I can't eat this soup. Take it back." And the waitress says, "You see, the prayers were answered." So.
And with that, we're away. We'll be back in a couple minutes.
A critical thinker is in a frame of mind of always questioning everything, including things they don't necessarily want to question. You may have done some research and satisfied yourself on a position you're sure is right. Good. Now, after a month or two of that, go look at some research that opposes your point of view or challenges the position you've taken. You can even look into it with the idea of poking holes in their arguments if you want, but it would be better to just have an open mind and read it as though you'd never heard or seen anything on the issue before. You may be very surprised what you learn, and if you're doing this right, you will be. Always be open to opposing points of view and counter arguments. That's what critical thinking is all about. And now you know.
Thank you, dear. Well, you're very supple. It's like I was at your age. Back then, I was a sex expert. Used to call me the buttered biscuit. I know about birth control, too. So you can ask me anything, baby.
Bedsider.org has birth control information and a lot more. And it's
Have you had sex in this car yet?
This is Richard Dawkins. Doing commercials is unfamiliar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humor, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait. Look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay.
Looks like it's done.
Don't let salmonella get funky with your chicken. On average, 1 in 6 Americans will get a foodborne illness this year. You can't see these microbes, but they might be there. So learn the right temperature to cook each type of meat. Keep your family safe at foodsafety.gov.
Body language can tell you all sorts of things. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911 and get them to a hospital immediately. Learn the body language and spot a stroke fast.
Why is Connor having trouble focusing in school?
Having trouble finding Connor's middle school? Would you like directions?
No, why is Connor having trouble focusing in school?
Finding lowest airfare to Istanbul.
No, I'm tired of fighting with him over homework.
Home walk restaurant. Need a review?
No, I need help. He's very smart, but his mind wanders. He's disorganized.
I think I understand.
Oh, good.
French fries. Finding best potatoes.
No!
Russet. Fingerling. Yukon Gold.
Why don't you understand me?
Sorry, I was trying to show how Connor feels every day. Frustrating, isn't it? Redirecting to understood.org.
For the 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues, this is what life can feel like. Explore understood.org, a free online resource about learning and attention issues, designed to help your child thrive in school and in life. Understood.org, because understanding is everything.
All right, guys, welcome back to Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century. We're now joined by Dr. Andy Thompson. He is the staff psychiatrist for students at UVA, and he also has an adult and forensic psychiatry practice. Additionally, he's a trustee for the Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, and he's also the author of this book, Why We Believe in Gods, which also, he showed me this copy just today. He brought this for Larry and I. Can you explain first, to start with, what's the significance of this?
First of all, thank you for having me. The significance is, for me, it's a reminder of how lucky we are. It is a translation of my book into Urdu by someone who must forever remain anonymous, and it was printed by printers in a country where that is dangerous to do, and it is a constant reminder to me that there are people who are courageous and who are willing to take risks to get these ideas out there. And it makes me very grateful to be in a democratic society where free speech is accepted and where one can write these books and feel safe.
Right. And I think it really is humbling that even what we do, in a sense, some people are a little uncomfortable. I know in my family, could this be risky to talk about religion in such a way as this? But we have to remember that the people that took this to print are truly putting their lives at risk forever. And it's incredibly powerful. It's a wonderful book. I understand why religion is worried about it, because it really does go through and explain all of the science as to why we believe. So it's a wonderful book, and I think we all really praise the people that put that out there.
And I just want to remind our audience that it's extremely courageous to have to print this in Urdu, which is the language of Pakistan and I think Muslim India. Is that correct? And even in places like Bangladesh, where recently, just very recently, atheist activists have been, hacked to death over expressing their free speech and their opinions about religion. So yes, this takes a lot of courage to translate a book such as this in those countries, in those languages where it's going to be seen by some Muslims. It may change some minds. So
let's hope.
Let's hope anyway. So
okay, so we're going to hopefully tackle 3 separate topics today. I'd like to start with evolutionary psychology, and then get into suicide terrorism, which you have a lot of expertise in, and finally why we believe in gods. Why don't we start with the evolutionary psychology, since that's sort of the building block. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the field first, when it came around, and what are some of the knocks against it, and how do you respond to those?
Well, in a sense, it first came around when Darwin published his book, Origin of the Species. If you look at the next to the last paragraph, he says psychology will be based on a new foundation. And it took a while for the rest of us to catch up with Darwin. But I think the evolutionary movement in psychology really took hold at the end of the 20th century. And the idea here is that Darwin gave us the only workable explanation we have for the variety and design of all plant and animal life on Earth. And he also gave us the only workable explanation we have for the design and architecture of the human mind. The mind is what the brain does, and the brain evolved under the same rules of natural selection as every other aspect of life. And so evolutionary psychology looks at opening up the mind-brain to parse out the adaptations that are in the brain that really create the mind. I think Steve Pinker has a nice analogy for it. The mind-brain is like the Apollo spacecraft. What's the Apollo spacecraft? It's this compact array of engineering devices that are solving a constant stream of problems, only a few of which reach the conscious awareness of the astronauts. And we have that kind of design to our minds. I'm looking at you and you're an upside-down two-dimensional image on my retina, and my mind turns it into this seamless three-dimensional view. Those are very specific adaptations which I'm not conscious of unless, say, for instance, I had some color blindness, then I'd be aware of an interruption in it. And our minds have a lot of social adaptations that are designed to solve certain problems. One of the ones that interests me is depression. My business tends to think of depression as purely an illness, but I think there's plenty of evidence that depression is a biologic adaptation designed to solve certain problems, particularly difficult to solve, painful interpersonal problems. Depression shuts things down, gets our mind to focus on the problem. It's painful, it sends signals to others. That depression can be viewed as like physical pain. It's unpleasant, but it's got a purpose. It evolved, and evolutionary psychology is dedicated to, in a sense, parsing out all those mechanisms that go into human behavior and thought.
That might be a great example. I was going to ask, one of the things that people say about evolutionary psychology, it's a lot of just so stories after the fact. And one way to counter that is with examples of, here's some of the predictive value it has. Did psychology have a good explanation for depression outside of evolutionary psychology, or is that really a new door that's been opened?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think psychology, we had some very useful explanations for depression. I mean, we've known that depression occurs when there's loss, for instance. Grief is the same. The description of grief is a description of depression. It led Freud to write Mourning and Melancholia, the similarity between grief and clinical depression. And so we've known, for instance, that a lot of depressions have to do with loss, but there was not an overarching umbrella, so to speak, that gave us in a sense, an ultimate explanation. In other words, depression, what is depression designed for? What is its function? And its function is to help us solve very difficult personal problems. And one of those personal problems may be the loss of a loved one. that leaves us with real problems that we have to solve. And grief is, if I'm grieving, one of the functions is to signal you that I need help, that I have to rearrange my social world. And I think that's, for me, I'm a clinician primarily. And the reason I'm attracted to these ideas is because I find them clinically useful.
Right.
And the idea that evolutionary psychology is just so stories, I think that itself is a just so story. In point of fact, I think evolutionary psychology has been more rigorous scientifically than what I was originally trained in, psychoanalysis. I mean, there's a lot of just so stories without good hypothesis testing and research. So that's my view of it.
So can I go back a little bit, and when you say, you know, depression is just, maybe to go on a little tangent here, but it's not necessarily a mental illness. At what point does it become disruptive in life, and maybe even from an evolutionary psychology perspective? Because, you know, there's certain adaptations that we all have that, for example, taken even from your book, and I think it was the faith instinct about, our addiction to sugar and fast food and things like that at one point were useful, but now it's kind of become an issue. So is that do you see depression kind of in the same way, but now it's kind of led to, because I suffered personally from depression and like many other people, but
well, I think it's an active area, and I think one way of thinking about it is, where does an adaptation become a maladaptation?
Right.
And then where's the line between a maladaptation and a serious disease? And I think with depression, you can see all of those.
The spectrum.
The spectrum of that. And for instance, if I have a fishhook in my hand, hopefully that's going to give me pain. And that pain is functional. It serves a purpose, even though it's miserable. It tells me, number one, I got a problem. Number two, where it is. It stops business as usual. I have to focus on that problem. And sitting here, I could hide a splinter in my hand. I couldn't hide a fishhook in my hand, and that would signal you. So that level of pain is still functional, and I would argue is not an illness. Now, let's say we get the fishhook out, all right, but my hand continues to hurt, and I continue to get radiating pain in my hand. Well, it has now gone into something that you could say is a harmful dysfunction, or and you get what's called a radiculopathy. The nerve root is irritated, and it's just continuing to send signals. And it's causing me dysfunction. So then I think you're moving into you're moving into a harmful or an adaptation becoming dysfunctional. I think it's important to make those distinctions, because I think there's a distinction between, say, a severe depression I might have after the loss of a job versus somebody who has, say, bipolar disorder, who suffers schizophrenia. I think those are significant distinctions. And I want to be clear here. I don't think that makes depression something that we shouldn't pay attention. Less meaningful, because depression can lead people to end their lives. I mean, depression can debilitate people. But I think you want to, just like we couldn't deal with a herniated disc from our back unless we really understood the anatomy and function of the vertebrae and the discs. And it's a similar sort of thing. I think you have to understand, in a way, the functional architecture of the mind to better understand when it doesn't work.
Right, and that's where evolutionary psychology kind of plays into this whole thing. And also, I think neuroscience falls into that a little bit as well. I mean, they go, they cross.
Hand in hand.
Hand in hand. And I know there's a lot of work in neuroscience right now trying to tease out how the brain and everything from behavior to cognitive abilities, everything, personalities, is working. But so why do you think, though, that evolutionary psychology has been getting some bad rap in some circles? If it's as legitimate of a science as the rest of them, why tease that one out and say, well, we don't know about this?
I'm not an expert on that. So there are people who are looking at that. I think it's a couple of things. Historically, unfortunately, Darwinism got used or misappropriated for the whole eugenics movement.
Right.
So anything that smacks of fitness and evolution, I think, is loaded from a historical perspective. But then, why the opposition now? I'm not certain. I think it may be tied to the general opposition to evolution in this country. It may be, I think, obviously in academic circles, in research circles, you know, what was the old saying? Science progresses one funeral at a time. And so there are people who are highly invested in their particular theories of things. So I think the opposition is probably many different strands.
And I guess we've talked about if certain groups, even liberal groups, hold certain ideologies, and evolutionary psychology comes along and says, here's what the science seems to point to about men and women, you know, gender issues, since we have different evolutionary pressures. If that goes against whatever they've concluded, they reject the whole science out of hand, and that's a real problem for liberals as much as anybody else.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate. And I'll just give you one example. Right now, I mean, I work at a student health service. And as everybody knows, campuses are having a real struggle with the problem of sexual assault.
Right.
And my bias is that we would do better if we were honest about what evolutionary psychology has showed us about sex differences, and also about what motivates sexual assault, the difference between men and women. And the evidence that all men, the three of us in this room, contain very specific rape adaptations. I mean, it's not that all men are rapists, but that all men are potential rapists. Because rape, historically, was a way that men could override female choice. Now, it gets confused with, there's the naturalistic fallacy, that somehow we're saying that, well, therefore rape is justified.
Right.
And nothing justifies rape, but it gives us an explanation. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's an ought.
Exactly.
And I think that has to constantly be kept in mind, that an is not an ought. Cancer is an is, it's not an ought. Rape is an is, and
it's not an ought.
Right. But I think if young men and women understood the dynamics of rape, and we were honest about the sexual differences between men and women, particularly at the time of young adulthood, where that's the point of life where the primary drive is mating, and you've got immaturity and alcohol. It's a disaster waiting to happen, and has happened.
Right, and it continues to happen because of the very fact that I think people don't want to talk about, you know, the so to speak elephant in the room about this issue, because of, you know, it's offensive, or it you know, it kind of demeans a certain ideology, and so, you know, but that's interesting because, you know, there's this feminist movement that usually is where I see, and it's not all feminists, but certainly a certain branch of the feminist movement is very much against evolutionary psychology as a science itself, and I think that's where the disservice is done, because you may not agree with some of the, I guess, the conclusions that some scientists in evolutionary psychology make. Just because you don't agree with some of the conclusions does not mean that the whole science as a method is flawed. And I think that's a very important distinction that I think needs to be made about evolutionary psychology.
Well, also, if you genuinely want to fix the problems, you need to look at the science, and if the study is wrong, correct it. But if the study is right, incorporate that into your mindset and our theories, and then build a system that reduces the amount of rapes. What I find just really painful is, I know we're all liberals, Sam Harris is a liberal, you get all these people that try to introduce a little nuance, try to follow the science, try to invoke critical thinking so we can actually fix these problems, and they get slandered. And if people aren't really aware of the minutiae of the arguments, all they hear is this guy hates women, or this guy hates Muslims.
Oh, he's a misogynist, and that's the end of it. He's a racist,
Right, and where evolutionary psychology is involved, I think the tragedy here on that issue is that some of the best, most productive, important evolutionary psychologists are women.
Right.
One of the founders of the field, Lita Cosmides. I would encourage anybody who's interested in mothering and parenting, any new mother out there, Sarah Hrdy, Mother Nature, Mothers and Others, like the world's expert on mothering. And she still calls herself a sociobiologist. I mean, she's really
She's
yeah,
sure refuses to take
the new leap. But and one of the best books and researchers on one of the best books on sex differences is the late Linda Mealy, and Nancy Siegel, one of the world's experts on twins. I mean, there's a tremendous cadre of women who, and they are feminists. I mean, they and they bristle at the idea that somehow they're not dedicated to women's issues and are feminists.
Sure. So let's go ahead and we have a call. Dante from Fairfax is calling us. Dante, can you guys patch him through?
Yeah, I can hear you all.
Good. Thanks for calling.
So I have a question for Dr. Thompson. I was curious about, I can hear myself, but I was curious if there was any sort of evidence for this sort of rape adaptation that you described.
Yes. I'd have you look at, there's a couple, and I don't, John and his wife, the last name is Gottschalk, and their work on pregnancy rates in consensual sex versus rape, and they show there's a huge reproductive advantage to rape. Also, Gordon Gallup's work on women's adaptations during the ovulatory part of their cycle in terms of increased strength. And there's, let's see, what other articles? Actually, Owen Jones, who's a lawyer, has an article on rape in the Berkeley Law Review that, even though it's technically a legal article, I think that's one of the best articles that lays out all the evidence for rape as an, because the debate is it a specific adaptation, or is it in a sense, the consequence of a coercive, aggressive male sexuality? So those are three of the things. Oh, also, I'm forgetting, Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer's book on rape. I would actually start there. And the beauty of that book is that both sides are argued in the same book. Randy Thornhill argues the rape as an adaptation. Craig Palmer argues rape as a byproduct of male aggressive sexuality. But there's just, I think there's excellent work out there. I think Thornhill wins that argument, but look for yourself.
Unfortunately, I haven't read those books yet, but it sounds like you're coming up with a conclusion and then sorting the evidence to fit that. Now, my understanding, as someone who likes to describe himself as a feminist sometimes, is that rape is more of a cultural byproduct of all these various cultural things that have sprung up over the past few thousand years, and not a product of male aggressiveness or a product of some sort of adaptation that coerces us to rape.
Well, again, I just encourage you to read, and I think you also illustrate something that burdens us all, which is that it is very hard for us to conceive of time beyond a couple generations. You say that this is just something, in the last, I think you said a couple thousand years or something like that.
Well, I mean, since the Neolithic Revolution.
Well, but yeah, that's the problem we're up against. Our genus is 2 million years old. Homo, small kin-based groups. Homo, 2 million years old. Our species, Homo sapiens, maybe 200,000 years old. And life was an endless camping trip with small groups of others, and all the things we're talking about evolved in that context. And I think I think there's plenty of evidence for rape as a male adaptation that lurks in every man. But again, read it, look at the evidence for yourself.
No, again, and as we mentioned, I wanted just to clarify that just because something is doesn't mean it's we should.
No, I'm not saying that.
Or that it's but. I think where a lot of the fear comes from is that data like this can then be used by those who would use it as a way to justify, and that gets into critical thinking, and I think that gets into this idea of knowing how to use the data and what it really is saying and what it really means. Certainly. And I think this has been the biggest criticism of evolutionary psychology from a lot in the feminist movement, is because they see it as a threat to women and giving men like some kind of empowerment to go out and rape because, hey, it's natural, it's in my genes, there's nothing I can do, sorry. I think humans are now a little bit more complicated than that, than just following some basic instincts of survival, because that's essentially what would boil down to survival and the idea of passing on genes. Certainly, we are a little bit more complicated animals than that. And also we see this type of behavior, this kind of even some moral type of behavior in even some animal kingdom, in the animal species, what we would consider rape, and so do some, other animal species would go and, they're monogamous, for example, for their whole lives. Some voles, a little mouse-like animal, they're monogamous. They don't go, the males don't go and, take whatever female. So, I mean, again, it's in the grand scheme of evolution, there's many ways that sexual reproduction goes.
Yeah, and again, we're not going to be exempt. We're animals, and we're not going to be exempt from the same forces that shaped other animals, and there are going to be aspects of our sexuality that are not going to be pretty. But again, I think the truth protects us. And let me just give you one example. I do forensic work, and a few years ago I saw a young man who committed a rape, and he got depressed, he dropped out of college, he was working a low-level job, he was drinking heavily, and he went to one of his drinking buddies' houses, and the buddy wasn't there, but the buddy's girlfriend was there, and he assaulted her. And he had no prior history, and he it was terrible. And what made it worse was that there was a child there in the home, and he then drove down the highway, realized what he'd done, pulled over, called police, turned himself in. And the judge basically looked at the case and said, how did this happen? Why would this guy assault his drinking buddy's girlfriend with a child there? And again, I think the explanation is that this guy's mechanism kicked in. Unfortunately, he was drunk, he was depressed, and it was a tragedy. And I think if you understand that, the more you understand, the more you have a chance of stopping it. And I think if we educated young men when they went to college that if they get drunk, they can get dangerous.
Right. Absolutely.
And similarly with women, being able to drink shot for shot with a man is not a feminist issue. I'm sorry. What is a feminist issue is what do you need to do to stay safe? That's, to me, is really the more pertinent feminist issue. But what I'm telling you right now on campuses would be seen as politically incorrect, and you would be seen as somehow justifying rape, and trying to get this across to the people who are most at risk is a difficult task these days.
Well, so are men blameless or something?
No, that's not what
I'm sorry,
this is about. He asked if men were blameless.
No, exactly. That's exactly. No, there's nothing here about moral responsibility. No, this young man was responsible. He acknowledged responsibility, and the judge, and the judge sentenced him. I mean, I suspect is still in prison to this day because of what he did.
Okay, well, let's,
Yeah, I think we're going to need to move on. We just saw that we don't have much time left.
Yeah, we don't have that much time left, but I do want to thank you for calling, but we do got to kind of move things along, so thank you for calling.
All right, and thank you for your anecdotal evidence.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
sorry.
Look at Thornhill for the scientific evidence.
I want to say that I know Robert Wright got the same kind of attacks. He wrote The Moral Animal, and he wrote The God Delusion, and he was really attacked as justifying all this stuff instead of just trying to lay out the science so we can actually deal with it. I don't know if people have a reluctance. They want to see things. It's easier if we see things in black and white. Here's a good person, here's a bad person. There's no ambiguity. But that kind of Manichaean view leads to all sorts of problems, and it just avoids the whole problem.
Right. So we've talked a little bit, and we need to move on, but we do want to mention one more thing. We've been talking about, okay, so some of the, what's considered to be the bad aspects of evolutionary psychology, but let's talk about something that evolutionary psychology has done that's positive. For example, race categorization. So I believe when we talked earlier, there was John Tooby and Robert Kurzban did a study on race categorization. Do you want to give us a little bit insight on what that was about?
If anybody would like to see something I think that has been done that's positive and is, I think, also interesting, is that they did studies that indicated that when we categorize race, what we're actually categorizing goes into a mechanism in our minds that really has to do with allies, coalitionary allies. And they set up experiments where that could be reversed. And so that's really the mechanism that is going on. It's, are you part of my tribe, part of my coalition, or are you not? And that's what's actually being used. That's the mechanism that's being used, so that race is not necessarily a hard, irreversible part of our minds that's going to lead to unalterable prejudice. And if you just look it up, Kurzban is Kurzban. He's the primary author, and the secondary authors are Tooby and Cosmides. I think it's in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is, I think you can get those articles without payment just online. Just pull it up.
Yes, and I think what was the name of the study I have here? It says, Can Race Be Erased? Coalitional Computation and Social Categorization is the name of the study. So if you guys are interested in looking that up, it's an interesting piece of work.
Now, I promise we're going to talk about suicide terrorism.
Sure.
Can we jump forward, and can you lay out what's behind that, both for men and for women, and how religion plays into it so well?
Sure. I think if you look at suicide terrorism, you basically see three things. Male coalitionary bonding with lethal rating against innocence. It's a capacity that all men have. The three of us in this room, we have that capacity. Male coalitionary bonding with lethal rating.
And you mentioned in your book that goes back beyond our species?
Yes, that the evidence would be that that's in the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees, because that ability you also see in chimpanzees, you see it in hominids, it seems to be in the fossil records with our hominid ancestors, so that suggests that it goes back, even to our common ancestor with chimpanzees. So it's a quality that's in all of us, all men, excuse me. So you have coalitionary bonding in males. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Secondly, the capacity for suicide. And I think the evidence would suggest that there are at least two mechanisms for suicide that we all carry. What I'll call bargaining and burdensomeness. And you've got that. Then the third is religion, or a powerful ideology that can grab onto those other capacities and generate suicide terrorism. And so what you see, I think, in general, is with most suicide terrorists are male. It's male-bonded coalitionary violence, lethal rating. That's 9/11. Young male hijackers, bonded, faith in Islam, a suicide mission. And theirs is, in a sense, the bargaining kind of suicide, because that's the kind of suicide that you're trying to force a change in others. This would be Gandhi going on a fast to the death to try to force the British Empire to change. And you usually see suicide terrorism arise when there's a military occupation of a region and there's tremendous military asymmetry. And so this is the weapon that they use. Right. And you see that for males. Now, the women suicide bombers seem to be different. The women suicide bombers, most of them are social outcasts, or they are, within their culture, they are not marriageable. They're infertile, or they're rape victims. I'm sorry to come back to the subject of rape, but for instance, the woman that murdered Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, Danu, she had been a victim of gang rape. In her culture, she's not marriageable. And again, the women suicide bombers, again, are still controlled by male coalitions. One of the first Hamas suicide bombers, I think her name was Reem Rashivi, something like that, she had been caught in an adulterous affair. She was, in a sense, forced to be a suicide bomber. The first PLO woman suicide bomber, Wafa Idris, married, infertile, divorced, living with her mother, burden on the family, depressed. But she was an ambulance driver, had seen a lot of wounded, so there was probably also some ideology there. But I think when you look at those women, they tend to be depressed social outcasts. It seems to be different from the men. The black widows of Chechnya, very few of them were actually widows. Again, divorced, infertile, rape victims. And so, but again, the capacities for suicide are utilized to attack.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting because it seems like within the cultural context, these women serve no other function within that society. So what better use for them than to carry out these suicide attacks? And that's a seemingly
sacrifice.
A sacrifice and a coercion from the male-dominated society that kind of, pretty much tells them, hey, you're pretty much good for nothing anymore, so why don't you go? And of course, if you're depressed, if you have other issues, and it's like, yeah, I might as well follow my path of righteousness, which is at this point is suicide bombing, which is sad.
Yeah, it is sad. It's tragic. And many of them, the thinking is that many of them might have committed suicide anyway,
right.
And it's preyed upon in a sense, and their despair is used that way. I think a third of the Tamil Tiger suicide bombers are women, and again, usually forced into it or rape victims, unmarriageable, infertile.
I was going to say, the first thing that we probably think of with the suicide bomber is how evil and nasty and terrible and broken those people must be. Evil didn't come anywhere into your description of those women, and maybe you can review the mindset of the male suicide bombers. I know you recommend The Looming Tower.
Yes.
You can tell us about Saeed.
Sure. Anybody who's not read it, I would really recommend Wright's book, The Looming Tower. I think it's one of the best books on 9/11 out there. And it contains a biography of bin Laden, of Ayman al-Zawahiri, and of Syed Qutb, the godfather of the radical Muslims. And then, of course, it deals with the terrorists. Or if you want to look, there's a Washington Post reporter who wrote a book about the young men. I think it's called Perfect Soldiers, something like that. But these are not mentally ill individuals. And the studies all show of the men, they tend to be healthier, wealthier, mentally healthier than age-matched controls. And educated. Large numbers of engineers among the suicide bombers.
And very morally driven.
And morally driven, right. They're morally driven and willing to sacrifice their lives. And it's hard for us to get our minds around. I mean, and they believe. They believe these ideas, and we need to take that seriously.
And this is, one of the reasons why I think that out here in the West, I'm not a big subscriber of religious and moral relativism for these very reasons. Within the context of a society, yes, they may think that, this patriarchal type of society that is Islam, where women are treated as pretty much, some kind of utilitarian, usefulness, and then when you're done, then what else are you good for? Well, either you get stoned to death or you get, pushed into doing suicide bombings, And so I think that's the danger I see in you know, cultural relativism is that, you know, how can that possibly be okay, you know, in any cultural context? But you know, but the whole thing kind of gets very messy when we look at things in those lines.
And again, if people are interested who are watching this subject, one of the best articles on suicide terrorism remains Scott Atran's article in 2003 in Science magazine. And one of the, I think, again, one of the best that is plenty of evidence to support the things that I was just telling you.
Good. Well, we got about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, actually a little less than that. Why don't we move on to summarize real quick on our third topic, which is the theory of mind and all psychological and neurophysiological mechanisms behind why we believe in God. Can you summarize that in about a minute?
Sure. Basically, few people appreciate that we are the first generation in the history of the world that has before us, we now have it, a basic psychological science of religious belief. We really do know the fundamentals of how human minds generate religious beliefs, the mechanisms they use, which came out of evolutionary cognitive neurosciences, why we're all vulnerable to generate those beliefs, to spread them, to subscribe to them. They come from everyday, ordinary mechanisms that we use to negotiate our social world. And to me, that's the amazing thing, is that in the last 15 years, there's just an explosion of knowledge, an explosion of books there, and the knowledge is accessible. It's all there in Barnes & Noble for you. And I think very few people appreciate that. We really do know the basics of it.
And also on the internet, too. There's
yeah, and the internet. Well, I'm showing my age.
Hey, can you quickly run through the different thoughts of religion as an adaptation versus a pure byproduct, if you think there's any overlap?
Yeah, one of the debates in the field is, are we designed for religion? In other words, is there a religious module in our brain, a religious adaptation that was selected for by group selection? And there's a group that thinks yes. John Haidt in his book, Righteous Minds, even Nicholas Wade, who I admire, and Faith Instinct. So that's one. And then there's another group that Pascal Boyer, Jesse Bering, other people who think that no, religion is a byproduct of mechanisms originally designed for other purposes. An example would be reading and writing. Reading and writing is a cultural creation that uses mechanisms that are biologic, designed originally for other purposes. Handwriting, vision. Not handwriting, fine motor skills in our hands, vision, and language. Biological adaptations come together.
We're going to have to kind of cut it off there. We got less than 30 seconds, but you know, this was great. Maybe we'll definitely have you back. I want to thank our audience for watching.
And on November 15th, next Sunday, Dr. Thompson will be speaking in Richmond. He'll have an hour to go over why we believe in God. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thank you to the audience.